Okay.
Should be okay.
Let's see. Well, let's see. You're not showing any slides.
No.
Is that right? So we don't have to move any of this stuff.
But a microphone.
Yes, we're going to. Okay. Where's the podium? Oh, there it is. Oh, yeah. Yeah, mine. Get one of those things.
Let me move this out. Right here. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
On the ball. So you bring a handhold Halloween too.
Yes. That's very active. I live on church. Okay.
Hey, you all hear me okay? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Yep.
There it is.
Good, you're good. That's a hot one. Please everywhere that one on that pick up just fine for you. You should pick up no problem for you.
Hello, hello. And it does.
Excellent.
Got so many new people here. And we're trying to train them about that. So it may not have as big as you're used to.
Oh, it's fine. Any number from 1 to none.
Well, it's where more than 3 gathered or something. 2 or 3 are gathered.
In the name of something now. Oh, 2 or 3 are gathered in the name of politics. We have a possible revolution on our hands, I suspect.
All right, you all have fun, all right?
Thank you, Steve.
Well, folks, it's nice to see a big group. We're starting to get back into the habit. And here is Polly telling me to swallow the ice cream cone. Good deal. Well, welcome, folks. We have an old friend here, as you can see, Dr. Bruce Anderson from Florida Southern College, chaired professor, no less, of political science and other things, I believe.
Other things, yeah.
Other things. And he's going to talk about culture wars. And people have asked me several times, and I was a little surprised, what are you talking about, culture wars? So, Bruce, first of all, you better explain what the heck culture wars are.
If I know.
But he, like most professors, prefers to ask questions, so be on your toes, okay? Take it away, Bruce.
Why, thank you, Gene. I sure appreciate it. I love being here. It's good to see my friend Bonnie back there and some other folks that I've seen before. And this is actually one of my favorite groups to talk to. And I'll tell you why. You guys read, and you're aware, and you watch the news, and you pay attention. And, you know, this is a failing, I think, of the generation behind you, declining all the way back to the one that I have in the classroom. I've had 3 classes today, so you'll forgive me if I'm a little shell-shocked to come in and give a lecture to a group that actually knows probably what I'm talking about. The earlier ones are all easy because they just assume that they are ignorant and therefore, you know, whatever I'm saying they need to write down, and God knows what it looks like at the end of the day, probably something pretty crazy. But I taught 2 classes in law and the courts where we talked about you know, the legal system in the United States. We're talking about constitutional review by the Supreme Court and so on, and we got into a long discussion about Roe v. Wade and Brown v. Board and Baker v. Carr and some of these other cases that had come before the court at one point or another. And there was a very clear division in the class as to where they stood on this sort of thing and whether or not the court should even be hearing some of these cases. My other class was in honors. And I have a freshman honors seminar, which is only 6 students, but they're very, very bright, and they come from across campus. I've got 2 that are in biology, 1 that's in chemistry, 1 that's in psychology, and the other hasn't made up her mind yet, but she's in my law and the courts class, which suggests that probably that's the direction she's headed. And we're doing something really interesting in there. We're talking about research, and the only real thing that you have to do in a research seminar is talk about how you do it. And so what you're doing it on is really something that you as a professor or they as students can arrive at and talk about and so on and so forth and try to get a semester-long kind of a gig with us. What they elected to do was, what is it that divides the United States? What are the things that divide us? We talk about culture wars as though it should be a no-brainer. We should all know what it means. I suspect it means very different things to our generation than it does to generations before. When we think about the culture wars, we probably think about the battles over the war in Vietnam, or we think about, you know, battles over, we think about the '68 Chicago Convention, Democratic Convention, or the '72 Miami conventions, or the battles over the presidency, or Watergate, or things like that. Those were the kinds of things that divided us then. And, you know, if you talk to students these days and you talk to them about something like Watergate, they remember the name because they've heard it enough, but they've heard it in other contexts. It's always, well, this is the Watergate of 1999, or the Watergate of 2006, or this is the Watergate of 2019. The pandemic reminds me of Watergate. None of this has anything to do with what was going on at the Watergate with the burglars and Richard Nixon and the rest of the gang and so on and so forth. They have no sense of their own history. Now, the students that are taking history are adopting history rather than having had it inculcated the way that our generation did, because we lived it. We experienced it. This was something that we came through, and I think we probably think about these things differently now than we do when they were occurring. I think that's a natural human reaction to sort of blocking a lot of bad things and heightening a lot of good things. You know, if I think about Richard Nixon outside the context of political science, I think about the opening of China, I think about détente, I think about those kinds of things. And eventually, of course, I'll get around to Watergate and, well, that SOB, and why did he have to do that? But, you know, but I tend to think of it in those kinds of terms. And I wonder sometimes about how this generation living through what they're living through right now will think about these kinds of divides as they go forward when they're our age and they're thinking about things the way that we think about them now. Because I suspect that the mythology of this era will be quite different than the mythology that we absorbed and that we inculcated as we were coming up. Florida Southern has had a very strict policy about COVID. I don't know how many of you are familiar with some of the battles that have gone on elsewhere about sort of what are we supposed to be doing and how many people are supposed to be vaccinated and all this kind of thing. But Florida Southern's Board of Trustees and our leadership decided very early on that they were going to encourage things like mask wearing, and we started one semester where we only had half our students there because they were all in single rooms and all this kind of thing. As we've gone forward, a lot of these restrictions have been dropped, largely because the CDC has dropped them. They've used the Centers for Disease Control rules as a functional rule book for the college, as well as a guide, as it were. And one of the things that rolled off while we were headed for spring break was the mask thing. You know, whenever you were in an enclosed space like this one, for example, you were encouraged to wear masks, and I noticed that most of you are, and I think that's probably wise. Gene said that I shouldn't, so that you'd be able to hear me. I hope I'm out of a germ zone here, so I'm not giving you all, you know, the flu or something as I stand here, or COVID, which, you know, apparently can be carried and you don't know it, and this kind of thing. But as we headed for spring break, there was a lot of discussion around campus about this mask rule and whether or not we were going to allow this in the classroom and so on. And our leadership told us that they were going to make it sort of universally mask optional, but not in the classroom. In the classroom, professors could decide whether they wanted masks or not. Well, I teach a class that is in a room not this big, but almost this big, and it only has 22 students in it. And so it's a relatively, you know, easy to get distance, and so they do occasionally work in groups and this kind of thing. Then I have this tiny little classroom, which also holds, in this case, in one class, the one that I just came out of, holds 24 students. And it's only about a tenth the size of this room. There are just about 24 seats in there. And so my thought was that the closer we were together and the less ventilation there was, the more likelihood we would have that students would want masks. But I also decided that with this interest in culture wars and so on and so forth, that I would let them decide. That I was going to wear a mask no matter what, that I don't care, you know, because I wasn't going to give it to anybody and I didn't want theirs if they were trying to gift it to me after spring break. But I was going to let them decide as to what they wanted to do, with the caveat that, you don't know whether you're in a room with someone who is immunocompromised or maybe particularly sensitive or maybe, you know, the debates that went on over this little thing, you would not believe the ugliness that came out of otherwise respectful and civil. They could argue about the death penalty. They could argue about abortion and never raise the kind of ire that this little thing gave. This thing right here, not vaccination. We don't talk about vaccination anymore. It's kind of a live and let live sort of a situation with the students. They're kind of, if they're anti-vax, they got their reasons. Maybe they don't like needles, who knows, as long as I don't actually have to be that close to them and so on. They don't, it's this. Why? Why, for heaven's sakes? And I had to search my memory as to what the heck it was that I went through that was even remotely similar to this. And you know what I remembered? I remembered the Beatles. I remembered my grandparents' reaction to the hair on the Beatles. And the kinds of things that my grandmother said, which were probably not printable, certainly wouldn't have been printable then, and might not be printable today. And she was one of these really civil, really suave, sort of Southern Belle type women from Richmond, married to an admiral in the Navy. And the kinds of things she had to say about the Beatles were not something the Navy would have approved of, even in context. And, you know, I started thinking about that, and I thought about all the kinds of silly things that we get ourselves into that have nothing to do with the proximate thing. Now, I have to excuse my own hair. This is a product of the pandemic, and I have actually been to I'm waiting for my daughter. My daughter actually cuts hair, and I'm waiting to get up to Omaha and Lincoln and allow her to cut my hair. So that's why it's there. But I feel like I have to say something because, you know, this crowd, we all remember the battles over hair, for crying out loud. Now we're at a point where none of us have any anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But back in the day, the battles over hair were very important. There were songs written about it. Almost cut my hair today. This crybaby song by David Crosby, I remember. I like David Crosby, but I mean, really, about hair? Really? Was it that important? It was a symbol, and it was a cultural symbol that signaled all kinds of other things. It had nothing to do with hair, and the same thing is true here. Although, you know, it's a little different. Hair is harmless, after all, pretty much, unless you get it caught in a garbage disposal or something. But masks, you know, represent, you know, a position on public health, or you would think it might. I don't know what it is that divides us, but I know it's not this. I know this isn't the real issue. There are other things behind this that this symbolizes for a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle. And I find it interesting that as Americans that we seem to shield ourselves from those issues and don't talk about them. There are a lot of things erupting in the United States that have been kind of cooking along for years that are suddenly becoming apparent to everyone. You know, we weathered a summer of mass protest with Black Lives Matter, for example. It was a reaction to the killing of Mr. Floyd up in Minnesota, as much as anything else. But it heightened and threw into contrast and relief a series of injustices that had been occurring for years, for as long as any of us have been around. And suddenly we were going to be concerned about that. There are a number of things associated with race that I think have always divided us in one way or another. But suddenly it had become really proximate to everyone's lives. The pandemic uncovered a real mistrust, not only of the medical community, of course, which is a little depressing for anyone that comes from an academic background, because, you know, we have our stake in things like facts. There are facts, and, you know, we tie ourselves to these foundational things and stuff like that. And when we stray from those things, you know, we wander on to really dangerous territory. But it was a mistrust in government. Mistrust in government, by the way, is not uncommon in the United States. It never has been. We were founded in revolution. We are always on the verge of some kind of revolution in this country, usually something that doesn't damage the system. But whatever it was that was spreading this discontent in the United States, it erupted on January 6th, a couple of years ago in D.C. in ways that I think shocked everyone. Nobody knew that the divisions went that deep. Even in 1968 through 1972, the height of the Vietnam War kind of stuff, you know, you did have terrorist organizations. There was Weathermen that bombed banks and things like that. But we never had the problems that Europe did, right? We never had the Red Army faction or the Baader-Meinhof crew or the Brigate Rossa in Italy that were kidnapping people and killing people and stuff like that. We really didn't have that in the United States. Although, you know, there are those that would argue that we've always sort of held close to ourselves terrorist organizations like the Klan. But I suspect the reason that we didn't have that in 1968 through 72 and beyond is because Americans have always been able to talk to each other. Sometimes really loudly, and sometimes, you know, spraying, and sometimes waving our arms around in the air, but we've always been able to talk to each other. My fear, and the fear of those honors students, is that we're beginning to lose that somehow. that we're all talking past each other rather than to each other, and that this new culture war, as it were, is evidence that something is fundamentally going wrong here. And I'm not sure that they're wrong, but I'm not sure they're right either. As I say, if I look back, I tend to paint history in all these kinds of glorious colors and the mythology of the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on and so forth. For me, anyway, is pretty positive stuff, all in all. But the more I look back at that period, I wonder if living in that period, whether I and the people around me may have felt very similarly to the way that a lot of our young people are feeling today, a little lost, a little untrammeled, a little not tied to the fact foundations and so on and so forth, and not really trusting much of anything around them. If we remember that generation, after all, we were part of it, then we remember that we felt those things too, and we felt them in a very urgent kind of way, in much the same way that this generation is thinking about the world that they live in and the context that they live in. We were also unsure about what the future held. We were also unsure. We're also unsure about the Russians, for crying out loud. Here they come back. Here comes Putin again, with his invading of Ukraine and so on. And I wrote an essay a couple of weeks ago that it just looked like the same old thing to me. If that's the case, if there isn't that much difference between the things that divide us now and the things that divided us then we're in pretty good shape, because we came out of that period pretty healthy, both economically and socially and culturally, and we made some changes, and there was progress, and we did move forward. And I've got to hope, and I'm an eternal Pollyanna on this kind of thing, but I got to think that the system that we're in doesn't really tolerate things like the January 6th thing very well. And that this system will move us forward in the same way that we were moved forward during the Watergate era to move on to something different and something new. Everybody remember Jerry Ford? You ever remember Jerry Ford? Oh, you know what I remember about Jerry Ford? He fell off of airplanes. He hit people with golf balls. You remember this about Jerry? You know why we remember that? Well, in my high academic research into the life of Jerry Ford, I can tell you why we remember that. We remember that because there isn't anything else about Jerry Ford to remember as president. He didn't do anything, and he did it with malice aforethought. Jerry Ford, when he took over the presidency, waltzed into office and decided he would do absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. He would continue the policies of withdrawing and so on from Vietnam. He would continue the domestic policies that the Nixon administration had put in, dealing with poverty and so on. There would be a continuation of things, but stability was going to be the thing that he wanted most. Stability had to be the earmark of the day. And so if you were a reporter and you were following Jerry Ford around and he never said anything and he never did anything, you concentrated on the golf balls. And every time the guy stumbled over something, the cameras were there because that was the story of the day. I hope for a day when we have a president that's like Jerry Ford, where what we're reporting on here is not today's dire crisis, but the fact that he's tripped over his wife's heels, chipped a tooth. Jerry Ford chipped a tooth today. Well, that's Jerry Ford. The guy can't stand on his feet. Of course he could. He was a wonderful football player for Michigan. He'd known for his elegance and grace on the football field. But none of that was revealed during his presidency because we were in a period of recovery. We were recovering from Watergate. We were recovering from the Tet Offensive. We were recovering from the '68 convention. We were recovering from a massive convulsion in the American polity that we'd never really faced down before. And it doesn't matter which side you're on in that culture war, any more than it would matter in this culture war which side you're on. I think we all got really, really tired of it. We all got to the point where we couldn't get to have a barbecue in the backyard without arguing about the war or arguing about hair or whatever it was. Now we're at a point where, really? This? I'm not saying that Joe Biden is anything like Jerry Ford. I mean, he wasn't a football player, clearly, and he is doing things, I think, largely because he's had things sort of forced on him from the outside, but I don't know. Maybe it's time for Jerry to come back something like that. Anyway, we are in the clutch of, we're fighting over things. We're fighting over things like, in Florida, we're fighting over the Don't Say Gay bill. We're fighting over abortion rights. We're fighting over a lot of legislation having to do with education and so on. If you guys want to talk about any of that, I'm happy to talk about it. I'll warn you in advance that I think the legislature was probably wasting its time with most of that. I wish they had paid a little bit more attention to the state park system, to our ecology here in Florida, to keeping our tourists coming, keeping our beaches clean, heightening the position economically of our small businesses, because they have suffered terribly in the last 5 years, particularly the last 2. I'm not seeing much effort on the part of the legislature to do much about that, and I think that's unfortunate. But with that being said, if you want to talk about some of the legislation that did pass, I'm happy to talk about it. But I do want to hear from you. As Gene says, you know, I'm a college professor, and I'm not much of a performer. So what do we have in the way of questions? Discussion points. In the back.
I'll try to get the mic to you, if that'll help. I do, and that's the hardest part.
I think of us as the Wild West. It's all about autonomy, self-reliance, ignore your neighbor. And the goalposts have been moved, but the left hasn't moved. It's been the conservatives that have gotten more and more extreme. I'm sort of in the middle.
I'm unsure what a conservative is. I'm unsure what a conservative, I know what a conservative was, but I'm baffled a little by the injection of the populist narrative into conservatism isn't a populist thing, really. If you think of, you know, the classics of conservatism, running back to Burke, I suppose, but think of William F. Buckley for a minute. It's hard to imagine Bill Buckley, Billy Buckley. No, it's William F. Buckley, and he was anything but a populist. He was a cantankerous kind of a, you know, gadfly that would pop up at the worst possible moment to puncture the balloons that the Johnson administration used to blow up about, we're going to house everyone and everybody, poverty is going to go away. And Buckley would stand up and say, well, not really, because let me tell you why. That was the conservatism that I grew up with. That kind of conservative. Fiscal conservatism, small government, government not doing much, and when it did things, it needed to have really good reasons for doing it. If they were going to extract taxes from us, they had to tell us what it was for. They couldn't just sort of globally tax people and then spend money wildly on things that they thought were good. I see very little of that, actually. You know, the Trump administration, which has been labeled conservative, spent far more money than any Democratic administration had ever dared to try to spend before on things. Now, part of that is the pandemic, and you know, you have to have a spirit of forgiveness for, you know, for some of that, but it was a pretty free spending operation. So I'm not sure what it means.
Question back here.
I have a comment. Can you hear? Okay. You mentioned the culture war of the 60s. Well, we have it again on here for African Americans. They're being discriminated against. They're making laws against them wearing fancy hairdos and all. It's hair wars again.
Yeah, and I cannot speak for the African American community and won't try, but I think one of the arguments that's there is that it's not a question of it coming back. It's a question of it never went away. You know, what changes did we really experience? You know, I think the Floyd killing, I think, brought a lot of this into focus for folks.
Feels like it's emphasizing the blacks and it's discrimination again, just like the hijab.
Oh, the hairstyles is what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, the hairstyle thing, I think, is a way of, I think what you're doing is you're stigmatizing people for who they are, and not what they do or what they think or what their dreams are, or something along those lines. It's about who you are. And anything that attacks somebody for who they are in this country should be a target for everybody around it. We have to stop things like that. Right here.
How do you think Dwight E. Eisenhower would fit into our situation, our culture right now? Would he be conservative or liberal?
Very difficult to say. That's a really good question. I'm not sure that we were sure then, you know, how Ike would have, I'm not sure he was not labelable in the usual sense. Not like his vice president, who was very clearly a conservative. Ike, after all, had a very clear sense of collectivity. He'd run SHAEF. He had run, you know, the Allied war effort, for crying out loud. He had had to keep the Russians, the British, the French, de Gaulle, for crying out loud, keep all these people on the same page for 3.5 long years, and somehow both keep them happy and win the war. You don't do something like that without having some real flexibility, both politically and culturally. So I'm not sure how he would fit. I'd be hard put to call him a conservative, but I wouldn't want to call him a liberal progressive either. Eisenhower, I think, was one of those classical centrists that placed himself. Now, what he may have thought individually as a person is another question. You know, his biographers would probably have a different view, but politically, he was certainly smack dab in the middle. Yes, sir.
Bruce, there's been so much misinformation and misunderstanding and intentional avoidance or confronting of what is known as the CRT, or the critical
critical race theory.
race theory.
Yeah.
And most people don't know what it is.
I don't either.
I'm even struggling with what it
I haven't the
is.
faintest idea what that means. I've been told that.
My only response to whatever it is that more and more we need to have a broadband inclusion of all our history, good, bad, and ugly. That's the way I'm dealing with it.
Well, I mean, you know, we can fool
Liberating
ourselves.
the freedom of schools, all the way from K to 12 to graduate level, need to include all that information.
I have to admit, I feel uncomfortable with the idea that students should not be made to feel uncomfortable. Students should feel uncomfortable. They should be challenged in those kinds of ways, and that, you know, whether that has a base in what we call race or class or privilege or any of those things, I mean, anything that stirs them up, I think, is probably good, even if it means throwing a ball into the room. I don't know. Critical race theory, though. You know, I was talking to Mike Denham. Some of you probably know Mike. He's a senior historian at Florida Southern, written all kinds of books about Florida history and so on. I said, Mike, what is this stuff, this critical race theory? And he said, well, you may not know what it is, but you've been teaching it for about 35 years. Okay. I'm reliably informed that the newest book, the book that came out back in, I think, finally hit the stands back in September or October or something like that, which is about Southern distinctiveness in policy making, that book was a clear example of critical race theory, because it demonstrated the difference between the way Southern politicians make policy and the way the rest of the world makes policy, and there is a distinction. And it is grounded probably in our history here in the South. The antebellum era reaches forward, as it were, to some degree. I never thought of it as critical race theory because I didn't know the term. You know, I don't know whether it is or not. If what it means is that you teach the history of the United States as though we have made some failings in the past, then I think, you know, it's certainly supportable. The interesting thing to me is that the Constitution has actually always outdistanced the American people in terms of making these things right. You know, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the so-called Civil War amendments, the Congress gave itself through amending the Constitution, the right to change a whole bunch of things. all of them targeted to things that had preceded the Civil War, like involuntary servitude and equal rights and due process for all and all these kinds of things. It was in the Constitution, it was enshrined in the Constitution that Congress could do this, but Congress elected not to do anything about it for 100 years. The Constitution is not to blame. The Constitution is a value-neutral turf for us to place our values in. It's not, it's not a document that is going to get up and walk on its own. For that, you have to have the United States Congress, and the United States Congress elected not to do anything until 1963. So, I don't know if that's an answer to your question. I think that a lot of the noise around this critical race theory business is that, there are people who are white that feel, not all entirely comfortable with the history of white folk in this country and their treatment of people of other characteristics and minority and so on, and that they want to feel comfortable again.
May be a slight sense of shame. How, the manifest destiny. Well, we can't talk about the manifest destiny if we bring in ugly things. You see?
No.
There's a concern that it is not justified in my belief, but somehow uncomfortable if you start criticizing this American exceptionalism.
As someone who actually believes in American exceptionalism, I think one of the exceptional things about the United States is that we recognize our errors and we correct them, or we try to correct them, and we move on. There are countries in which these kinds of things are enshrined forever in their legal systems, in their constitutions, in the way their governments do business, and so on and so forth. I'm looking at if you look over the broad sweep, and I don't want to get into an argument with an Eastern historian or anything like that, but the broad sweep of the Tsarist regimes in Russia through the Stalinist period into Putin's regime, you see very much repeatable patterns in the way that they rule the populace, in the way that minorities are crushed, in the way that censorship is always, that they always have had a secret police and all this sort of business. Those things get enshrined in countries sometimes. And I think the exceptional thing about the United States is that people like us get up and go, wait a minute, I don't think this is a good idea at all. Let's change it, and we do. I think that's exceptional in the world. I think that other countries find it more difficult. I think this is a system that lends itself to change.
Question over here.
I read recently, you can hear me? Okay. I read recently that Hitler was actually promoted by the conservative element at the time, okay?
Historically, I mean, the Stahlhelm got behind Hitler once Hitler looked as though he might be chancellor. There was an exhaustion in Germany with a minority coalition government that the left and the right were the big pillars of the voting blocks, and you had this sort of middle, and that's where governments had to be made. Eventually, the Stahlhelm, which was a veterans organization as well as a political, and the German People's Party got behind the Nazis and supported them, but the Nazis really did this on their own. And it bears remembering that this was not a democratic process, that the elections in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s were very violent affairs in which, voter fraud was in fact rampant, in which, ballots disappeared, whole district ballots disappeared, unions fought against Nazis in the street, and so on and so forth. It bears almost no resemblance to an election today, either in Germany or here.
Leading into this question, supposing we're in the freest state in the union now,
Anybody that listens to a politician about things like that, you should have their head examined. Any politician, not just our government.
laws that are getting passed recently by our state are really curtailing the freedoms of the people. if you stop and think of it. They're telling you can't do this, you can't do that. So we're free as long as we do what he wants us to do, right?
I'm not sure I'd put DeSantis in the same bed as Adolf Hitler. But having said that, I don't think I'd put anybody in that category. One of the things about DeSantis's initiatives, and you have to remember this about politicians generally, especially ones that are in executive power, they're going to do things that will aggrandize power to themselves, but their primary goal, his primary goal, is to run for president. And so he's making a point here. He doesn't expect any of these laws to survive the courts. I think that we can be pretty confident that most of them won't. But I think he knows that. I think he's bright enough to know that. I do. I think he's a lot smarter than folks ever thought he was. But I think he's making a point for his base and making it. He still has a gamble here because, you know, if Trump decides to run, then Mr. DeSantis is going to have to break with him. And it's going to come down to a battle between the two of them. And I know which side I would pick. Yeah.
Comes back this way.
What news source would you recommend that's journalism and not entertainment?
Well, it's all entertainment, one sort or another. And I say that guardedly as somebody that writes a column for the USA Today people. I mean, a lot of it, you have to seize the reader's interest and you have to talk about the things that readers are interested in. And as far as that goes, it's all entertainment. I can tell you what I read every morning. Before I finish my first cup of coffee, I read the email from the New York Times, I read the email from AP, the Associated Press, I read parts of what Reuters sends out, and I read Die Taz, which is it's a Berlin newspaper, and it gives me European news and so on and so forth. So typically I spend about a half an hour perusing that stuff. I pay absolutely no attention to television news, I have to say. I'm not interested. And I'm not interested in the commentators, only when they erupt into idiocy, which they do almost always. And then, of course, you have to pay attention to them because you'll get a student that will come in and start repeating that nonsense. It doesn't matter to me which side it comes from. It's all nonsense anyway. So, but that's what I typically. Sometimes the Washington Post, good for congressional stuff, but the Congressional Record or the Hill Rag or something like that is also a good place. I have a lot of friends that will email me their little tidbits from DC and Tallahassee, and that helps too. So private sources of information maybe. But I think I'd go with the tried and true. Look at the stuff that you've looked at probably for the last 50 years, and you're probably going to be pretty much on target. Fox wasn't around, CNN wasn't around, MSNBC wasn't around. Think about the sources that you have always used and whether or not you still trust them. I don't listen to NPR, and I'll tell you why. The reason I don't listen to NPR is because it's boring and it's long. And you know, there are people that, and bless you all if you are among them, that has the time to listen to a 3-hour story about a family in Kiev. But is it true? Yeah. Oh, sure. I'm sure. I mean, the National Public Radio has great reporters. Sure, but it's depth reporting, and depth reporting is something that almost no one has time for. I mean, in my experience, I don't know. NPR is long. Sometimes I catch top of the hour or something like that on Alexa. You know, I have one of these home things that will occasionally spew a story at me, without any warning or anything, and it's very often from NPR, BBC, but it's really long. I think it's good, but you know, I don't have all day to listen to the news. I really don't. I don't think you do either. I don't think anybody does. But occasionally a story will come out of NPR that will find a home, you know, in sort of the viral universe, and then you've got something. It rises to the top because even though it may be 3 hours long, it's a worthy 3 hours, and I'll listen to something like that. Definitely. Yes, ma'am. They have great people. I'm not trying to denigrate NPR.
I have a kind of a, I hope I don't start too much of a controversy here, but my generation grew up with a deeper faith than the world has now. And that was our standard. And I feel like it was a golden age when we grew up, because even though there were the wars, there wasn't this kind of thing that just shoots everything to, any principles that we lived by. And that started in the 60s. And they took God out of schools and all the rest of that stuff. And I think many of us feel that way, that loss has led to a lot of things that are just beyond us.
Loss of positivity, it's a loss of, sort of hopeful views of the future. I agree. I wonder how much of this is due to the pandemic. I don't want to downgrade the effect of the pandemic, but there are other things at work as well. I think people get exhausted by bad news. One of the things that NPR does do is that it tells us good news from time to time. We get a good story, something good happening, and so on. Whereas the television talking heads tend to be pretty unrelenting in terms of their horrible horror news and, click on this, but be warned that it's graphic and this kind of thing. I don't think, 24 hours a day of that kind of thing is going to make anybody very hopeful. I wonder, I wonder about faith. I wonder, whether, and it's not just church attendance and things like that, which I do think is, can be important. But I wonder if faith in a higher guiding power of some sort, not being particular as to what, maybe that's missing, or it seems to be missing somewhere along the way. I don't know. Now, talking to Tim Wright, who is the leader of the Youth Fellowship at Florida Southern, he will tell you that there are a whole crew of young people that are drawn to that probably wouldn't have been drawn to it had it not been for their friends encouraging them to come along and so on and so forth. I think hope is like anything else. It spreads when it has the right messengers. And, I know that they have like a weekly lunch and things like that where they sit out on the lawn in front of the Fannin Center and there's a little talk, that one of them gives on a Bible verse or something like that. Now it's restricted to, well, not restricted, I mean, anybody can go, but it's a Christian service. But Hillel is also pretty active on campus, and they've done some interesting things and drawn some people to Temple Emmanuel and so on and so forth. There is a Muslim group on campus. I'm not entirely sure when they meet, but I do know that they meet for prayers at least in the evening. So there's a presence in this younger crowd that is there, that's based in that kind of faith. It seems to me. So, I think there's hope. Literally, I think there's hope. But in the wider population, I don't know. Pretty negative crew these days.
Are we still caught in the same world that we were in after World War II, when everybody thought if anything went wrong anywhere, the United States would have to fix it? It looks like it today with things in the Ukraine and other places. Years ago, I took a course from Reinhold Niebuhr in Christian ethics, and he said they were, his two large poodles were like the rest of the world and the United States. If anybody got in trouble, they'd always look to him and say, "Get him out of my bed," and that was how the rest of the world was saying, "You take care of it for us." Are we still somewhat there?
Well, I think to some degree we are. I think that there's little denying that the United States is still the most powerful country on the planet, both militarily and economically, and that's a role that we all think we should probably hold, but it also requires certain kinds of civic responsibilities also. The developments of the last 10 years tell me that we are moving away from military interventions and things like that. I think the Iraq War, the Afghani War, the Syrian experience, whatever it was, and so on and so on, has taught us some valuable lessons about getting embroiled in trying to create cohorts of democracies and things like that. The thing that was so popular, during the 1990s, the whole idea of, the neoconservative movement of creating democracies and so on, I think is probably pretty much dead. One of the encouraging things about the Ukrainian situation, as I see it, and one of the things that is an outflow of the last president's foreign policy, is an increasing self-reliance among European nations. That the Germans are taking leadership, the Germans and the French and the British and et cetera, other nations in Europe are taking onto themselves responsibility for their own security. Largely, in this sort of bitter way at the beginning, we don't trust the United States anymore and all this kind of thing. Well, fine. Well, then you're going to have to do something, and they have. I think Angela Merkel is probably responsible for a lot of that. A lot of it was probably a reaction to our president, so we do play a role in it. But I do think it's healthy for us to see some of these highly industrialized, very rich countries take on the task of their own security. Ukraine has, I think, brought them together in ways that probably little else would do. It reminds them of what NATO was started to do, and that was to resist what was coming from the East. So I think there are some positive signs out there. We don't have to do it all. We still have to pay for a lot of it, that's for certain, and I think we're all seeing the effects of that. But paying for it with dollars and not with American blood is probably, I think, we're progressing. We're moving ahead. So the answer is, as always, mixed. I think you have a good point that, how much have we really changed? Not as much as we probably want to, but we have changed some. We're not accepting the responsibility of Europe's security in the same way that we would have in 1965. I don't think. Yes, sir.
What's your take on the Christian nationalists? What's your understanding of them?
Christian.
Influencing politics.
You mean in Ukraine, not like the
Christian nationalists in the United States, the ones where I understand the term to mean very, very conservative Christians who most of them voted for Trump, and also they want to create some form of a Christian Sharia nation.
Who knows? I mean, these are the usual kind of racist, anti-Semitic kind of crew that these people are always hanging around the margins. They are always out there. They have always been with us. They have never been able to have any real power. They have gotten some attention. They've gotten a tremendous amount of media attention in the same way that anything scary gets attention and so on. But I remember when I was at Rice as a graduate student, there was a movie out called Blood in the Face that made its debut at Rice, and you might want to take a look at it sometime. And it was about white nationalism and the Nazi Party and the Klan and all these kinds of things. And they had this great big convention up in the backwoods of Montana or somewhere, and there were about probably all of 450 of them. I don't think they're terribly influential. I think they're we're paying way more attention to these people than they deserve. I think that ignoring them is probably the best thing. Let them do the things that they do and arrest them for the stuff that they do that's criminal, and let the rest of it kind of go by the wayside. But I refuse to take them seriously as a political force. I'm sorry, but there it is. Those have never been popular views in the United States any more than communism has ever been a very popular view. Back when the Communist Party of the United States was so-called active, probably 70% of its members were FBI agents. So I suspect the same thing is probably going on with that crew. I don't know. Charlottesville was horrible, no question. But they had to get those people from the entire United States. They did 3 years of planning to bring all those people to Charlottesville. And in the end, how many did they get? 1,500, 2,000 of them maybe? Yeah, there just aren't that many. So, I don't know. And they don't vote anyway. And they may support Trump, but I don't know. I don't know if they know how to pull the lever. Other questions?
Point, I think a lot of people feel, because of the attention they get, that there's just tons of them out there. And
Oh.
it's fearful, but it's not. Anybody, last questions? We've got a little time. He doesn't have another class. I hope.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, you got a loud voice.
The immigration situation, okay? Now, all throughout the world right now, there's so much strife going on in many countries right now. And immigrants are flowing out of Africa, they're coming out of Syria, from all over. We're getting them from South America. And these people, you know, are all leaving bad situations. I just missed a good program that was at the University with Mike Dennis, thing with Mary All. I don't know if you want to or not.
Yeah, but I've heard Jose talk before.
The thing that's, I wonder about the Cuban people, you know, a lot of them came over, and they're very opposed to any immigration that's coming in their country for some reason. I don't know why so much when they were given the benefit of coming.
I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think if you are a restaurant owner of Cuban heritage in Miami right now, you'd like to see more immigration so that you would have that that initial layer of workers that come in with immigration that are people that are unskilled, that you can pay minimum wage and so on. And so I think we have a labor shortage in the United States right now. We oddly enough look a lot like Germany did before Germany absorbed all the Syrian refugees. And boy, people were so angry. It was the founding of AfD and all these other anti-immigrant organizations and all this kind of thing, until they actually arrived. And when they arrived, they took on the American plan in Germany. Instead of putting them in immigrant hostels, which is what the Germans had done time out of mind, they took on the American plan and integrated them into German communities, taught them German, taught them how to operate with banks, taught them how to do the documentation, which is far more complicated there than it is here, and led them through the process of this is how you do this if you want to work here, and found them jobs. All of a sudden, AfD wasn't getting any votes at all. Why? Because the guy that was working next to you at the restaurant was from Syria, but he spoke German, and he understood, he was a dishwasher, but, he was working his way up somehow, just as immigrants always have in the United States. So I'm not sure we can, target, people of Cuban heritage particularly. I don't know, maybe that's true.
I'm not targeting them, but I've heard a lot of their comments of people down there that feel that way, that we shouldn't be allowing the immigrants in. They slow, and I know when the Cubans first came, the people that came at the beginning were the business people that lost it when the communists took all their business over. But then later on, then when the boat people came over, supposedly they were all criminal people that people wanted.
Well, some of them were. The Marielitos were the product of Fidel's prisons, and some of those were real, not as many as Fidel thought. I mean, criminal activity in Cuba would probably be perfectly acceptable here in many circumstances, but some of them were criminals. I mean, some of them were.
The point I'm making is we're being told, well, all these people that are coming up from Mexico and Guatemala are all criminal people, and they're all drug people, and rapists, and this and that, and very few percentage-wise probably are.
Yeah.
They're all coming to Florida right now, so we have to stop them. Any of them will come to Florida.
No, I think you go about 10 miles outside of Lakeland, out into Polk County, and talk to some of the folks out there about how they feel about repressive immigration and so on. They'll give you an earful, because these are the people that come and they pick the fruit. These are the people that come here and they do the hard work that is necessary to keep our agricultural communities going. This is the third leg in the three-legged stool in Florida is agriculture, and it is absolutely dependent upon immigrant labor. I think the narrative has changed a good bit from, say, 2 or 3 years ago when we were talking about immigrants as, you know, this is part of that presidential campaign in 2016, for example. That's 6 years ago. Things have changed since then. And what we're learning is that immigrants have always, in the United States, provided that layer of folks coming up that fill those jobs as people move up. What has happened since the pandemic is that a whole group of people have moved up a level, and all of a sudden, the people down here at, you know, at the lower level are looking for dishwashers and can't find them because they can't find somebody that's willing to work for that wage. Immigrants very often will. I hate to sound, you know, deterministic here, but that's how an awful lot of us got here. And that's how a lot of our families have moved up in this world. Yes, ma'am, I think your hand was up first.
How would you feel towards NPR if the stories they were telling were about some of the 150 children that have been killed? That was estimated. I haven't watched it yet. To me, it would absolutely be worthwhile to listen to those stories. I didn't care how long.
In Ukraine?
Yes.
I saw one slide. There's a woman that I know that plays professional tennis, and she sent me a slide, and the slide was a slide of 175 strollers that were out in a square. I think in Kiev. It may have been elsewhere, but for me, that's all I needed to see. That brought it right home to me. You know, because you know, it's just absolutely horrible what's going on, and we can all identify with the blood and with the guts and the, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But that slide for me, you know, hit me right where it hurts. Just horrendous.
Question, there's a lot of sound and fury, or I don't know if it's sound and fury or if it's real, about quote unquote the loss of democracy, voter laws being changed to restrict voting more. Is this a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, or is it a significant trend in terms of what, from your perspective?
Well, you know, depending on who you talk to in my community in political science, it's either the greatest threat we have ever faced to American democracy or it's nothing. I'm not going to say it's nothing, because anything that restricts access to the polls, I think, is a bad idea. There are elements that I think we need to be careful about. I think when we cut back the number of voting precincts where people can vote in person in counties like Harris County in Texas, I think that's a bad thing, because I think people should be able to vote, and I don't think they should have to line up for 4 or 5 hours to do it. I'm not entirely persuaded that voting IDs are a bad idea. We had in Florida, we had voting cards. If anybody has been here long enough, you remember, you used to have a card that you had to bring with you, and your number corresponded to your name and your signature on a voting thing, and you had to, I'm not convinced that that's a bad idea. I can tell you as a political scientist that voter fraud is a lot of nonsense. There isn't any in the United States. The state that had the most voter fraud in the last election was Mississippi. Nobody knew very much about it because it didn't matter in Mississippi, and almost all of the voter fraud was on the red side of the ballot. So, and nobody really cared because that's the way Mississippi was going to go anyway. Why they bothered to do fraudulent things there, I have no idea. Maybe it's a Mississippi thing, you know, do the illegal thing when you can. I know that doesn't exactly place me, but I'm not as concerned as many are with some of those laws.
I have a question about what your thinking is about the Supreme Court. First of all, let me begin by saying what I think about it.
Okay.
I think the Supreme Court right now, at the present time, and probably for the next 10 years, is no longer a third branch of government. It's the tool of one party or the other and I have no faith in the Supreme Court whatsoever at the present time. I wonder if the time may eventually come where it will get back to the place where it does represent a fair execution of the Constitution and where it is really a neutral or a third branch of government. Where do you come down on?
Well, very solidly on the idea that there's nothing to worry about with the Supreme Court. Any lawyers here? Well, okay, it's safe. Judicial conservatism and judicial progressivism is very different from political conservatism and political progressivism. Conservatives on the court, for example, we were talking about Eisenhower a little while ago. One of Eisenhower's great, sort of horror moments was the realization that having put in a conservative Republican former governor of California, he had just doomed his party to 20 years of activism on the Supreme Court. Right. Impeach Earl Warren. They used to have bumper stickers. Anybody remember this? Earl Warren, and he was a conservative Republican. He is from California, which made him a little weird probably, even in the 1950s, but he was a conservative from California, and he'd ruled with, small government, low taxes, developers, let's get ag behind us here. He won in the Salinas Valley. I mean, he had the backing of some very conservative people there, and he got on the court and people said, let's talk about civil rights, and he said, yeah. Let's talk about civil rights, because he was a conservative, but he was not a political segregationist conservative. He didn't break the mold. He was a conservative with a real conscience. And there were things that came before the court that Eisenhower had hoped he had stemmed off for at least 10 years by appointing Earl Warren. But Warren and then Thurgood Marshall, for crying out loud, I mean, the next thing you know, the whole place is going to hell. Although it didn't. And here's the lesson. Judicial actors at the Supreme Court level are appointed for life. And they're appointed for life for a reason, so that they don't have to be owned by a polity, by a constituency, by a political party, or by a president. Almost all of them outlive their presidencies by at least 10 or 15 years. Those people are long ago back in the ground or wherever they came from by the time these folks are still ruling on things. There is also tremendous fellowship on the court. The appointment of people like Gorsuch and Barrett and so on, I think, irritated a lot of progressives because they didn't get to make the choice. But I think what you're going to see is something very similar to what you've seen over the last 100 years of the court, and that is a court that is careful about review, that when they do review something, they're likely to parsimoniously whittle it down to its elements, and then they're going to rely on precedent. As a conservative court, they're much more reliant on precedent than some of the more liberal aspects of the court that we've seen in the last 50 years. I don't think we're doomed at all. I think there's a pretty good crew up there, to be honest with you. How will they rule on this or that? I don't know. And, this is another thing. When Roberts ruled against, ruled for Obamacare, for example, remember the lightning storm that hit on the conservative. How could he, what a traitor that man is. He's not a traitor, he's a conservative judiciary officer.
We're getting some positive reaction out of this political scientist. If you were expecting a lot of negativism, Pollyanna, he said.
This is a good system. It's worked for a good long time, folks.
A lot of hope in what he's been saying.
Oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
I think we should give him a big round of applause.
Thank you guys for being here. And thanks to whoever made this. This is a cool thing here. Very cool.
I have to say that the Carol, who does our, now read this and so on, she's the one who came up with that beautiful image.
That's a good one.
I created the flyer with no image. I just put cultural wars. She says, I don't see an image. And she says, let me fix it. So that's...
Background in PR, I bet you anything.
Oh, she's good. Let me just tell you a couple of things about next month. The Academy runs on and on and on, It's kind of like NPR, public radio. I hope it's not ever boring, however. On April the 4th, that's our first Monday, we have Nancy Marsh, who's here with us back in the back there. Nancy works over at Circle B Ranch, and she observes the birds there and their behavior. She has some great slides, and she's going to talk to us about birds and their behavior over there. That's going to be a kind of a change of scenery for us. On April the 18th, we get back to a little bit more, shall we say, serious, more serious than birds, but birds can be helpful. We have our own Sharon Buccino, the two Buccinos sitting right here, their daughter, who is an advocate for land preservation. She will be talking about federal land preservation, legislative efforts, lobbying for protection of lands. So you'll want to do, that's March 18th, I think. Is that right? April. I'm sorry. April, next month. Both of those. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. Don't forget to come next time. All right, one last
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
And he's good enough to come often, so we'll have him next fall again. Yeah.
For the election, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
But I've lived in historic places. I like Latin America, the first witness of the Reagan government and others. So there are a lot of times when politicians manipulate the system. Very difficult. Anyhow, I appreciate it. That's a good excuse.
I admire your columns. Someone else. Degree here. Under